Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, a place for learners. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Harris, and this is a podcast dedicated to becoming a better therapist. Today, I'm super excited for my host, Dr. Antonio Pascual-Leone, who is a expert on a few different things. Process, which, if you've followed anything that I do, is a big part of what I teach, and an emotion-focused therapy. But I'm going to kick it off to you. Can you please give us a little bit of a background on therapy you do? Like, what is emotion-focused therapy? What does it generally say the problem is? And what's the solution?
Okay, in a few sentences. So first, thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight. When you reached out, I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. This will be really be um, interesting and a good way to kind of explore ideas together. So thank you. Uh, what kind of therapy do I do? You know, I also wrote I do emotion focused therapy. That's the quick answer. Which is it's a humanistic experiential approach. Its antecedents are Gestalt therapy and person-centered therapy. So it's a very process-oriented therapy. So I wrote a book on using emotion-focused therapy to treat complex trauma, co-authored with Sandra Puglio. And so that's something I worked on. But when I study therapy, I'm not only studying emotion focused therapy, I'm studying emotional processes at large, how they occur in almost any approach to therapy, because the process ultimately belongs to the client. We like to think that we facilitate certain processes, we do, but therapists choose the intervention. The client ultimately chooses the process. So we're all seeing the same clients. And I think there's a lot to be learned by looking across approaches. So I also work very integratively across treatment approaches. What else did you ask? What the problem was and the
Hmm.
solution? Yeah.
Yeah,
An experiential approach is, especially if you're focusing on emotion, is thinking of the ways. What's the problem? The ways people get stuck working through their experience and what it means. Because experience is ultimately about what does that experience mean for you, who you are now, who you want to become, and so on and so forth. So mapping onto emotion, you if you want something very concrete, there could be lack of awareness. Because if you see emotion as a source of information, densely packaged units of information, then a lack of awareness would be a problem. Truncated emotion, that would be a different problem. You can interrupt your feelings. You might have maladaptive emotion, which would be experientially learned, right? I was mentioning I wrote a book on trauma. Child abuse messes people up quite a lot, and you learn stuff that actually isn't good for you. The person thinks they're a piece of garbage. And then finally, there's instrumental emotion, which are also socially learned. So the premise is that emotion out of the box is good for you and organizes you and is pregnant with information that we can make use of. But there are these moments where you don't have access to that because of lack of awareness, because you truncate it, or because the emotion you do have access to is maladaptive or is more socially loaded. It's instrumental or manipulative, or right. So those are the kinds of problems, and the solution becomes to think of emotion as a guide, to look for deeper experience, not just the emotion of symptoms, but emotion could be a symptom, sure, but it could also be a process through which people change, to have a deeper and richer experience that you can make meaning out of, and that'll help propel people forward.
I love that. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? Emotion is important. It organizes us. It tells us what's important to
Mm-hmm.
us. And also then, if it gets sort of truncated, or if we feel an emotion and we feel another emotion about, maybe feeling of guilt about that initial emotion, or if we're unaware of our emotions, that can cause all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
Could you give like an example of like a clinical example of a type of emotion someone might feel, and then how that gets disrupted in some way, just so people can
Sure.
sort of have a picture of it.
Yeah. So, you can imagine situations where I'll try to give a couple just to sort of imagine you grew up in or the client, the person grew up in a place, in a world, in an environment where nobody talks about their emotions. Well, that's all fine for the most part until you have a really strong emotion about something and you don't quite know how to use it. You don't have the vocabulary for it. You know, these people are often highly alexithymic. Alexithymia means no words for feeling, but it's not a vocabulary problem. It's they don't perceive the world in that way, and it has to kind of be mentored. So you can actually help people become more emotionally aware. So we imagine somebody like that. They might not know what they want in life. They don't have a clear sense of what they need in life. They just have a sense that something isn't right. We can imagine a different scenario, where a client has a healthy emotional experience. I talk about that in my book, for example, somebody who has a healthy emotional experience because their partner dies and they feel grief, they feel a sense of loss, but that person also has a 2-month-old baby. So what do? Well, you put your grief on pause because otherwise your baby's also going to die. 2-month-old needs not some of your attention; they need all of your attention. How long do you put your thing on pause? Your grief on pause? Well, for quite a while. It's not going to take 2 more months or 3 more. So for years perhaps. And this person shows up a couple of years later. The kid's now like 4 or 5, and she says, I can't move on. I have trouble meeting people. I'm not interested. I am interested at the same time. And it's just, I'm still stuck in the past. That's an example of truncated emotion. You haven't been able to make use of the emotional experience. Right? You can think of other examples. I'll give one more where the problem isn't lack of awareness or truncated emotion, which are solved really by awareness and expression. But you could actually have maladaptive emotion. You see this not just in everyday life, you see this in clinical problems where people may or may not present clinically, but this is now we're talking about psychopathology, right? Where, as one client said to me, she said, if you, it's hard not to feel like you're a piece of garbage if your whole life people have been taking you out with the trash, end quote. And it's like, yeah, and then you have if you think in your bones you believe you're unlovable, and it's not just a belief, it's that it just feels true. It might seem to make no sense, but it feels true. Then we got a whole other kind of problem. So these are mini clinical vignettes, let's call them, of the type of problems people will have in terms of emotion.
I mean, this really, I think, clarifies this idea of process. And I want to make a distinction here, and I hope you can tell me if this makes sense to you. Because one of the big unlocks for me in my own work is thinking in terms of process. And most therapists, they think in terms of models, right? So
Oh yeah.
if my model is EMDR or trauma-focused CBT or solution focus or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think, okay, this client comes in with a problem, and I'm going to do the EMDR sets. The problem's going to go away.
Mm.
Not
And
that,
sometimes it does.
and sometimes it does, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, or they come in with, a problem, and I do the CPT reframing or the trauma focused protocol, and sometimes it does. But
Mm-hmm.
what you're really saying is, and if we do any sort of a diagnosing or assessing, it's usually based off of the DSM. They have depression, they have
Correct.
anxiety, they have ADHD. So this is what I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to do. And what you're talking about is more of what is the pattern of emotion expression this person is coming in? That's the process. And then that dictates the treatment.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and if I can kind of riff on that, one thing is diagnosis and assessment, and the other thing is treatments work, but the question is why, right? So, I mean, this is good news. Treatments work, right? Um, I'll start with a preamble. Like you got a ton of outcome research which tells us treatments work. Well, that's fantastic. Great. So what do I do? Because treatments work on average. What do I do with my client for whom the treatment is not working? And how do I make my treatment better if you're interested in developing treatments? Unfortunately, outcome research will not answer either of those. It won't tell you how to make your treatment better. It just says do it, do what I told you. And it won't tell you what to do when your treatment is faltering, when you're struggling with a case. The outcome research says you should have done it better, but it doesn't tell you how you fix your problem, right? Because treatments are good, but they don't, it's not 100%, right? And I think they're still, this is new, we can still develop treatment. So let me pick up just two things. One, I love that you point out the DSM is basically symptoms, right? It's a description. It's an interesting thing. For the time being, it's unavoidable that, like, if we were medical doctors, if you were in medicine, you wouldn't tell me I had a broken arm because my arm hurts and it feels weak. You would take an X-ray and be like, dude, this part of the bone is not connected to that part of the bone. The ET, right? We're looking at the causal agent, the causal reasons, and you'd say that's a broken arm. You wouldn't tell me I have diabetes because I feel a little lightheaded. You'd say, no, we're going to do a test. Your blood sugar drops this fast in this period of time. You say that's diabetes, right? So most diagnoses in medicine are tied to causal agents. We know you have dementia because we've looked at, dementia is a special example. We know you have Alzheimer's because we've cut your head open and looked at this, and there's these little bodies in there that are kind of, and clearly that's what makes the diagnosis. But psychiatric mental health problems are diagnosed in terms of symptoms, which is why, like, depression actually can look a lot like anxiety, and anxiety actually overlaps a lot with depression, and so on and so forth. There's huge overlaps in the different manifestations and so on and so forth, because they're talking about descriptions, not causal agents. If we did something more like medicine, we're not ready to do it yet, but one day, perhaps, the diagnosis would be more related to what about this person is not functioning well in terms of process, right? Maybe the diagnosis would be poor emotional awareness, and that's feeding the problem. Or maybe the diagnosis would be you beat yourself up a lot, negative self-treatment. Or maybe the diagnosis would be unresolved interpersonal difficulties, unfinished business. You know, in some sense, those are much closer to what's actually driving the depressive symptoms or the anxious symptoms, or which could have the same or very different causal agents. So I think that's one thing about assessment and the role of process there, and really trying to understand, is it as clean as it looks just because you have a diagnosis? And the other thing I mentioned is treatment. Yeah, treatments work, which is great. But treatments were developed not with a perfect understanding of how people process information. That's not how treatments, that's not how treatments were conceived. Treatments are developed based, and there's nothing wrong with this, based on somebody, some person with a pretty good clinical hunch and being like, I don't know. I think it's done like this. And it's either exposure or it's working cognitively or it's working in an emotion-focused way, right? All of these originally come with somebody with a hunch. And so you have a treatment theory that's based on that. And then later you develop empirical evidence to support these are the important processes. But none of the treatments are developed based on a comprehensive understanding of processes, right? And so what happens later is, in the treatment manual, it says, well, if you do this intervention, you name the couple from different treatments, then usually treatment manuals say, then it produces that process, right? And there might be research evidence to support that, which would help, right? Sometimes there isn't, right? Because outcome research isn't telling you about that. But sometimes there is. The thing is, there might be a whole lot of other processes as well, and they have been unaccounted for. Not to mention that clients actually choose the process. I started out by saying therapists choose the intervention, but clients choose the process, which is why we have these very funny things. Like I'm going to call, in the book, I call them fat finger interventions, which comes from typing. Like if you had a really fat fingers, this is like on your phone, for example, and you hit the wrong key, you get a typo. It's a result of, and you didn't know you made that typo, right? We've all sent that text. Well, a fat finger intervention, let's imagine, is here it is. The client says to you, "Hey, Jordan, that session or intervention was that the last session was really helpful. It was really helpful. I really appreciated that." And Jordan says, "Oh, awesome! That's great. That's great." Pause, pause, awkward pause. So which part of the session exactly was, and if you're like any other, most therapists, this happens, right? And actually, I'm glad it was helpful, but I don't know what was helpful. And I don't know why, and I don't know how. So here we see the disconnect that I provided the interventions. It was useful in some sort of way, but I don't know how,
Yeah.
right? I've had a positive impact and I don't know how. And you can see how important that the process isn't synonymous with the intervention, right? So I've kind of
I mean,
given you thought there, but
you're saying so many things, and one of the big things I think you're sort of pointing at is a lot of research which was popularized by Scott Miller, basically
yeah,
saying all these models work and they all work about the same. And
yeah.
I think part of what you're saying is they work well on average, but part of what we're missing to make them really work well, and to see what really, really works well, is a nuanced understanding of process. Because
Because
treating one
which
person
process
with
when?
which
I mean,
or,
I think you're pointing out which person, which is totally true, but then it's also which process when. Yeah.
totally, totally, because one person who has anxiety or who's been diagnosed with anxiety, to your point, is not the same as someone who's been diagnosed with anxiety. It's not the same at all, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
also to this point of because I think we've all seen this with our clients. You have someone who comes in and they say, I liked, this is what I do in every first session.
Mm-hmm.
I say, have you seen a therapist before? And clients will often say, yes, I saw so and so for a year, and the first 6 months were really, really good. And then I don't know, I feel like we kind of become better friends and client and therapist, and so I wanted to try someone else. And my
Mm-hmm.
read into that is they were able to help you
For
to a
the
certain
first level.
point, right,
Mm-hmm.
through certain processes. And then there was something that, as a client, we shouldn't expect you to do this. So I mean this on like a meta level, but there's something that you couldn't quite articulate to them about where you needed to go next. And they weren't
Mm-hmm.
quite able to see it. And so you sort of fell into this pattern. And because that you liked them and you had a strong bond and they helped you so much, you stayed for 6 months. But at some point you said, I'm still stuck
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm
You're hoping to.
confused.
Yeah.
So I'm
Uh-huh.
going to try someone else.
Yeah.
And so then they come see a different therapist, right? Who maybe has an intuition about a different process, but they haven't been trained in it. And so they sort of, maybe they can help you, maybe they can't. But it's a similar sort of thing, I think I'm hearing you say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. If there are different processes, if you're interested in emotion, then you probably have heard people say you got to work with the emotion. Or, if you're interested in process in general, it's follow the process. Well, that's nice. That's really great. But which process when, right? If there are different kinds of processes, and there most definitely are. So I mean that's a first hurdle. If we're going to agree that there are qualitatively different kinds of processes, sorry about that. Then it's like each process is a different kind of tool, right? All right. Well, I mean, if you're going to build a house, you're probably going to need a lot of tools. So, which tool are you going to use when? You're just going to use a hammer for everything? No. Sometimes you can use a hammer, sometimes you use a screwdriver, sometimes you can use a saw. And depending on the task, the immediate task in front of you, You're going to change the tool you're using. So, there are markers probably, right? Things clients do or present with that says, in my toolkit of processes, we need this to happen, right? And of course, you might be thinking in terms of interventions, but a lot of interventions could be used in more than one way, especially the more complicated the intervention is. It could probably have more than one purpose, let alone the fact that the client ultimately will choose how to use your intervention. A really complicated intervention is, for example, chair work, right? I've written a number of papers on chair work and done meta-analyses on it, and it works. It works really well, and it works in many different ways because it has many steps and it's kind of complicated. So that becomes another kind of small illustration of, yeah, but how are you using this intervention at this time? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's double click on that, right? Because I think what you're saying is you could use chair work
Sure.
to work on an unfinished business sort of thing, right? If a client comes in and they're
Mm.
talking to you and they say, it's like my mom's voice is always in my head, just
Yeah.
criticizing me. You could say, oh, that's a marker for unfinished business.
Ding
Let's
ding.
do chair work to do that. But you
Mm.
could also use chair work to clarify some part of someone's experience if there's a lack of emotional awareness, right? So I don't know what I
Or
feel.
for case
Perfect.
formulation,
Or for case
right?
formulation, yeah.
So there's this part of you that does this, and this other part of you that does that. And the client goes, yeah, I never really thought of the fact that I do beat myself up quite a lot. Bam. You've used chair work for something quite different than unpacking the actual experience. You're just mapping out a case formulation, right? Which is
Yeah.
kind of let's call it a narrative understanding of what my problem is. Um, so having a better understanding of the processes you're trying to facilitate will make your interventions more impactful. Because you already know the interventions. If somebody's listening to this podcast, it's because they already have a couple of interventions under their belt. The thing is, what were you trying to do when you did that intervention? And if it's not working, how would you change the intervention? You have to keep your eye on the lollipop. And in this case, the lollipop is, which is the target process for this particular problem, right? Clients have strengths and they have weaknesses in how they process information or work through things, in general, sort of as traits, right? But they'll also have moment by moment lapses and needs, right? So yeah.
I mean, so what would you say are the core processes, or at least the ones that have been identified so far by research?
Well, I'll just make a quick caveat and
Mhm.
say, um, the relationship is super, super, super important, right? Um, if we so there, you can frame all of this in terms of how the person works with their emotion or their experience or their meaning. You could also reframe it all in terms of the relationship with the therapist and how that is actually a process that facilitates positive change. And they aren't antithetical. This is kind of like talking about, is the sun moving around the earth or is the earth moving around the sun? Like, you just pick a point of reference and we'll work from there. What is for sure true is, if you're working with the relationship, focusing on um, the relationship can be a mechanism to change, but ultimately something has to change, not in both of us. It has to change for sure in me if I'm your client. So if I feel differently, it is because something inside me has rearranged. It may have rearranged by virtue of what you did in our relationship, but it has to rearrange inside me. So now your question was, what are the processes? And I'm going to say, well, so I'm going to say five major ways that the person can become different emotionally, right? It's like a chessboard. It's like, yeah, some pieces move on the horizontal and the vertical, whereas other pieces only move on the diagonal. Whereas the rook does this weird two steps forward, one to the side kind of game. And those are very different ways of moving. They're different operations. So, you could create an exhaustive list of processes. Most treatments have their pet processes, which are partially supported by evidence. And then there are other processes. Some people have processes that seem sort of to be the omnibus. It's like, well, my process does everything. You see that when people talk about emotion regulation. Emotion regulation is actually apparently everything. Mentalization has some similar problems where mentalization is apparently everything. So if it's everything, it's not really anything. That doesn't give the therapist some concrete handle. I wrote a book. It has 800 references. It took me 12 years to write. The problem is because it got more and more complicated. Very comprehensive, covers the research that's available related to emotion in every treatment approach. Also looked at the neuroscience and looked at, I also think these things don't just happen in therapy, but they should map onto how people change in everyday life. So it has 800 references. It took me 12 years to write. It was very painful. And, I'm going to say there are 5 major processes, 5 qualitatively different ways of changing. When somebody changes emotionally, what is the emotional change? There are 5 qualitatively different things. Kind of like how one says on a chessboard, you could move on the horizontals verticals, or you can move on the diagonals, or you can move the 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, like a rook, like a horse. So what are they? Well, one, let's start with the easiest, downregulating. Just calm the heck down. It's like just turning down the volume, right? We could talk about later if you want how emotion regulation is usually said to be everything, but actually in practice, if you look at the examples, it's almost always talking about downregulation. So I think it's better to be more congruent and transparent, to be like downregulation, turn down the volume. Second process, emotional awareness, becoming more aware. That would be engaging emotion, approaching emotion, finding the label, call it affect labeling, some people call it that. Maybe deeply symbolizing the experience. Let me give you a third, expressive arousal, increasing. Now we're talking about turning up the volume. It's not just the antithesis of turning down the volume. If you know how to drive a standard, well, not even in all cars, the gas pedal and the brake pedal are 2 different pedals. That's 2 different mechanisms, right? Same here. So getting people to express more emotion and feel it more is its own change process. There's a lot of evidence for that. So now we have 3 change processes. The fourth one is this is a new kid on the block here. This is changing emotion with emotion. The idea that you would have a discrete emotional experience, say shame, and that it could be put in a sequence of emotions, say followed by assertive anger or pride, that the second emotion can undo the first emotion. It's not just a matter of time passing. It's not just a matter of exposure. It's actually that the combination of experiences can undo maladaptive emotion. That's a different change process. And then there's a lot of evidence for that in a whole section of the book. Each of these 5 processes has a section in the book. And finally, you can think, and they cut across treatment approaches, evidence across treatment approaches. Finally, you can think of narrative reflection. When you step back and you look at the big picture, now the big picture could be big in the sense of looking at this, reframing this situation, the classic cognitive reframe, or it could be a much bigger reframe. It could be like an existential reframe when you start thinking about, wait a minute, I feel upset, but what's the purpose of my life? That's another much larger scope reframe. It's more similar to the sort of scope that's used in psychodynamic therapies, but the basic mechanism is to work with the surrounding context of information, which then changes how I feel. So these are 5 different ways of working with emotion. I'll call these 5 major processes: downregulation, awareness, more expression, sequences, and narrative reflection. Um, you could always say, well, why not six processes? Why not seven? Why not 13 or 62? Right? And the answer is, well, I think the way I wrote the book is you have to have a different neurological substrates. And so there are different neurological substrates supporting these different processes, which supports the idea that they're indeed different, and they're not exactly the same, right? Um, eh, the other thing is, I think you need different interventions. If you don't have an intervention to facilitate a process, then what's the point of having this conversation? So different processes used for different interventions used for different processes. Um, and I'm writing not just for researchers and theoreticians, but for clinicians. So, if I'm like, oh yeah, the 14 processes of change, look, that doesn't that's a lot of things to bear in mind. So there's value in being as parsimonious as possible, having as few processes as are supported by the data, right?
Yeah, I
Awareness and
mean,
expression are the same, but actually they're not, right? They're measured differently. They have different neurological substrates. They have different interventions and so on and so forth. So those have to be different. So how many have to be different? We end up with five.
I think, if anyone wants a shortcut for all this,
Hmm.
read chapter 25 of your book, which you should name your book.
Which is the conclusion, right? Yeah. So you're like jumping to there are 25 chapters. Chapter 25 basically lays it all out, right?
And
Um,
it is
the
the last
book is
chapter,
called,
but it gives such a clear overview of like
yeah,
everything
yeah,
of the
yeah.
five big processes that I think it makes the rest of the book. It's like, oh, I have the five buckets. Now I can just put everything into these different buckets.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the introduction does say, look, there are five things. Let me prove it to you, right? So it's, but I mean, the conclusions there are about which processes, for whom, and when, right? And so then, and every point, there's a lot of bullets in there, and every bullet is because there's more than one study to support it. Do you know what I mean? That's how I have worked. This is just a research synthesis that kind of across treatment approaches that resolves a lot of the contradictions. Because if you read stuff, it's like there's a lot of contradiction. This treatment approach says this, that treatment says that. Um,
I
they
have a
might both
great,
be true. They might both be true, but the question is when. You asked about the title.
yes. Oh, yes. Please
Principles
name your
of
book.
Emotion Change, right? So the book is called Principles of Emotion Change, What Works and When in Psychotherapy in Everyday Life. It's available everywhere, and it's 2026. It just came out.
I remember when I was reading, I was teaching a class on motivational interviewing, and the I forget which book I had,
Uh-huh.
but they're going through the, um, the sort of core techniques, right? And how change is incremental and you want to see people's autonomy. And then they would have these vignettes of sometimes change happens rapidly.
Yeah,
It's like
the
this little
sudden
box
gain.
off to the side, right? It's the sudden gain.
Yeah.
And they told the story about this. There's a guy who was having trouble smoking, couldn't stop. And then he has to go pick up his daughter from school.
Hmm.
And he's waiting in the rain to pick her up. He's in the car. He's like, I just want to go get a cigarette. So he drives across the street to the corner store, gets a cigarette, comes back and starts out in the rain. And he has this sort of epiphany. And he's like, I I can't be the kind of dad who leaves his daughter out in the rain to go get a cigarette and stop smoking.
So,
And for me, the juxtaposition of this book is basically saying change is slow. People have to make their own decisions. We go step by step. There's autonomy. But then also there's like these moments where we know something else just happened that is not in this map that is deeply transformative for people.
yeah, yeah. And that would be That's in chapter 22. That would be an existential insight, an existential reframe, right? Where I have to start living my life differently. You see that in existential therapies. You see it in acceptance commitment therapy, where it's a values based choice. You see that in a psychodynamic therapy, where the person, there's an interpretation. It's like, you're living like this. Is that how you want to live? It's not really working for you. And the person, usually it haunts the person for a bit, and then they say, no, I'm gonna, and they choose a new direction. So this kind of reflecting on emotion is a way of working with emotion. And that might be the reason why someone quit smoking. There might be other reasons why people quit smoking, which might have less to do with the existential moment and more to do with new habits, lifestyles, habituation, and that would be much kind of slower and gradual. But certainly there are these pivot points, right? Sudden gains, excuse me, don't only happen in motivational interviewing; they actually happen in 30% of all treatments across. You study it anywhere, you'll find roughly 30% of the cases you see have some sudden gain. A sudden gain is a very significant drop in symptoms within 1 week between two sessions, where the person doesn't relapse. So those are the gains that contribute to their final positive outcome.
What's your
Um,
sense of those? Or is your sense that there's a common process there, right? Because are certain processes quicker than other processes in terms of,
well,
that can be
I
very
don't.
complicated, but yeah,
That
what's your
it is
sense of
very complicated.
sudden gains?
It is very complicated. I could just say the research on sudden gains is very inconsistent. It's very hard for researchers to show what explains the sudden gain. It was discovered in cognitive therapy. So obviously it's going to be a cognitive insight. They study the crap out of it. And this cognitive change seems not to predict the sudden gain. But the studies that do show this explains sudden gains, I say it's inconsistent because different studies are showing different things. It's hard to explain, and the same thing doesn't keep coming up. I think there's also the thing that from a psychodynamic perspective, you can imagine somebody working on something, and then they make a decision, and then you have a sudden gain. But of course, the catalyst of that wasn't the session before; it was like 20 sessions before. You know what I mean? Before they let the
A
arrow
threshold
fly.
sort of
Yeah, so a
model.
threshold or vulnerability or critical period, life choices, these sorts of things. I think it's less important to find out exactly what causes a sudden gain because it's not, unfortunately, it's not going to be a silver bullet and everybody should just be doing this one thing. No, it's not that simple. Um,
No, it's not that simple. I heard someone once say, "There's no silver bullets, just 1,000 golden BBs." You know,
I love it. Death by a thousand golden BBs. Yeah,
you
yeah, but
know,
that's
just
exactly
keep
that's
shooting the beast with the 1,000 golden BBs, and it'll eventually, yeah.
there's yeah, there's a quote from William James which basically says, I have it at the end of at the beginning epigraph to the last chapter, but it basically says, I don't believe in big change. The bigger the change, the more mendacious, the more hollow. And he says, I believe in the invisible molecular forces that move moment by moment through the crannies and build a harder, newer kind of reality. Um, but that's what we're talking about. I think if we're talking about emotional development in our clients, because we're not just talking about removing symptoms, are we? We're
Well, I
talking
think
about
that's
helping that person grow up into a
the
different person.
fallacy of downregulation, and that's something I appreciate about the book that you talk about. It
Hmm.
seems to me that a lot of therapists, and I know why this happens, because clients come into your office, and your heart is to help these people. And so you want
Yeah,
to do what's going to help them to feel better, obviously, right? Like there's no
well,
maliciousness here at all.
it may be as fast as possible because
And as
it's hard
fast
for
as
me to see you suffer,
that's
right?
also
Which is
part of
also
it,
part of
right?
what's going
Yeah.
on.
I think also part of it sometimes is a lack of training. Not all training is equal.
True.
Um, And it's hard. It's really hard to get really good training. And so you
Mhm.
do what, I mean, so you do what you know. But I think that does create this sort of systemic problem where a lot of therapists think that most of therapy is helping people cope with symptoms via downregulation. And you
And
actually have
it's
a pretty, mhm.
and I'm saying it is a way. I named 5 processes and I put that first. I said this is the most straightforward one. But if that's your only process, you're going to have some serious problems.
Can you talk about, and this is for me why the last chapter was so clarifying, because you basically go through and you say when to use this, when to not use this.
Yeah,
So can you break that down a little bit for us? Like when would we not to use emotional,
down regulate,
yeah, to use
down.
down regulation?
Yeah, yeah. Because it's intuitive, right? Um, just try to get you to feel less. We'll turn down the volume, and that'll solve the problem. And it's counterintuitive that you would engage emotion um, to help work with pain. Even like,
That's a really good point, right?
it is
That it's
counterintuitive.
counterintuitive to engage emotion and increase it, and it's highly intuitive to down regulate it. So there's like
Sure,
this
and
built-in bias.
like and you see this again and again, different scenarios, and I'll even use myself. Like, I do research. I've dedicated my life to this. I've done this for almost 30 years, right, of research. And I train people on how to work with emotion, interventions, how to increase emotion, how to. And when my kid came to me the other day, and he's 9. He's 9. He's bawling his eyes out. It's so painful as a parent that I found the first time I was like, whoa, 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 hey, 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 slow down. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be, and I'm shutting him down. He actually had something legitimate to be upset about. He wanted something. It's sad that he's not getting it, and it's just plain sad. What you really need to do is work with the grief on some level, right? He wasn't so upset that he was like dysfunctional or gonna hurt himself or he wasn't going bananas, but it was so hard for me to see the tears coming down his cheeks that I, despite everything I know, I had a moment where I'm like, whoa, 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 shh, shh, it's gonna be okay. Like, I'm trying to shut him down, right, in that moment. And so this is an anecdote, personal anecdote. Nobody's perfect. It's also an anecdote about how counterintuitive it is, right? For therapists, even expert therapists, and for clients. So it's also the client doesn't want to be. If you want your client to talk about their feelings, and they say, "Do I have to?" You better have a damn good rationale. Because if you don't have a clear rationale or sales pitch to your client why we are going to work with feelings and it's going to get muddy, um, then you're dead in the water, right? The client is asking for, well, why, and you better have an answer. The analog, let's say, in a cognitive behavioral therapy is, you know, you're scared, you have a phobia of dogs. We're going to put a little program together here. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to expose you to dogs. And the client goes, what? Did you not hear the part where I have a phobia of dogs? Like, this makes no sense. And you're going to have to give them a very good rationale. Why expose you to dogs, right? So similarly for emotion, if we're going to go in, you need a good rationale. But there are times not to. That's where you started, right? There are times when don't downregulate. In a nutshell, here's when you don't, right? Um, think for a second, what does downregulation do? Yeah? Turning down the volume, feeling a bit less can be really useful because it temporarily, and that's the problem, temporarily, sometimes is good, staves off an emotional experience. I'm going to shut down this feeling, and that temporarily, ideally, would be helpful. Um, Temporarily, because emotion typically signals that something's wrong. It typically signals that something needs attention. If I go to the example of my kid there, I'm shutting him down. I mean, I shook my head and I sorted myself out, yeah. But like, yeah, he was sad, a missed opportunity, and he was not able to participate in whatever the school play and stuff. So he was sad, and that's a legitimate thing What are you sad about? What does it mean? What are you going to miss? And we explore that. Okay. But so emotion orients him to that here to be unpacked set of meanings. If I downregulate, it essentially staves off that possibility in that emotional experience. So you should downregulate in moments of crisis. Right? My kid was not in crisis. You get really emotion-oriented therapists, really experiential therapists, person-centered therapists is like, oh, you never shut down the client. It's experience. Really? What if they call you and they're standing on the edge of a building? I hope you're not like, let's make meaning out of this, because that is not the time to make meaning, right? In the moments of crisis, suicidality, the critical moments where the person has urges for self-harm, substance relapse. These are moments where downregulation, anger, right? And avoiding emotion is often considered bad but that's also usually tied to anxiety research. Avoiding anger, if you are prone to violence, is a damn good idea in the short term. There's probably other things to work on, but right now, when it's too hot to be in the kitchen, everybody should walk away, right? So it has its time and place. I'll say that. So when isn't the time and place? I'm taking a long time to answer your question. One, if you're just managing everyday life situations, you don't shut down feeling just to manage everyday life situations. You might do it in a moment of crisis, but not for extended periods of time. That'll be number two, not for extended periods of time. If you're always shutting down the feeling every time you think about your sadness or your anger at your brother or whatever, maybe that needs some attention. You can't keep just stuffing it down, right? If you're solving significant life concerns, it's time to feel your way through it, not just turn down the volume, right? That's for a crisis. But you have significant life decisions. How would you know what you want to do? By accessing and exploring your feelings, Relatedly, the person is searching for purpose. What's the meaning of life? What's my purpose? You could feel anxious, feel upset, and then just shut that down, but you'll never find your purpose in life. If you're looking for existential meaning or purpose, you're going to interfere with that by downregulating. And now we go to therapists. Some therapists are working with clients, and their core problem is that they don't have a sense of purpose. If you shush your client there, you're missing where the richness would come from, even though it's hard to see the client feel like they're floundering and so on and so forth. And a lot of this is related to when the primary emotion that the client is feeling is actually tolerable. My son, that example, he was sad, tears rolling down his cheeks, but he could handle it. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't pretty. It was ugly, but he could handle it. That's time to work with that emotion. Don't turn it down. And I'm going to say, even if that emotion is maladaptive, and the grief example, there was no maladaptive emotion, but if somebody feels like they're a piece of garbage, you could just try to turn down the volume, but you aren't grappling with the problem. You have to grab the bull or the monster by the horns and say, okay, this is what we're dealing with, right? And the only way to do that is actually engage emotion. It has to be tolerable enough to make meaning. Your client is so upset that they can't talk properly, and that's that. Okay, whoa, turn down the volume, because that client at that moment, they can't make heads or tails of, you know what I mean? You could say nice things, but to the client, it sounds like the parents of Charlie Brown. The Charlie Brown cartoon. It sounds like like they don't get what you're saying. They need to calm down, not to zero, just to tolerable, and then we'll make some meaning.
That's also an important part of this, right? Is that the downregulation doesn't have to be to zero. It just
Yeah,
has to be to
it
tolerable.
actually shouldn't be, right? There's a window of tolerance, because the other thing, there's a low level where I'm not feeling much, and the problem is then you don't have access to your feelings, right? So it's kind of like you got to heat it up a little bit. Engaging and activating emotion is where you feel your feelings, and then you can make meaning out of them. You can't make meaning out of them if you're not feeling it. It becomes just intellectualization. And,
Look, um, we're coming up to the end of our time. I've really, really enjoyed this. And I just have one or two last questions for you.
super.
My first question is for you as someone who spent, I mean, this, you know, tome. It's funny, we were talking beforehand because I read this book online, and so I didn't grasp how big it was. And I read it chapter by chapter. The way I got it was in chapters.
Sure.
And so I didn't grasp how big it, but this is like a tome, right? Which I really think speaks to your dedication to the research
Hmm.
and also to being very precise and very clear so that we as clinicians can have clarity on which process is the client bringing to us and how do I need to handle that. If people read this book, what do you hope they take away from this book?
Um, if I can, I'll just say it is a big book. Um, and I had a lot of like usually it was not my first book with APA, but they're like 400 pages, manuscript pages. That's what, and if it's too long, that happened to me before, they make you cut it back. And this was getting long. It was getting longer and longer because manuscript pages, including references, don't worry, it's not that, is like 700 something. Do you know what I mean? And it took me forever. And I was saying to my father was an academic, not a clinician. He was a student of Piaget, had a big career as a developmental psychologist. And, he was in his 90s now, and I was like, it's getting too long. They're not going to accept it. They won't publish it. They won't. And he was like, you have to write what you have to write. The idea has to be intact. The integrity of the idea is more important than who's going to publish it. If they don't want to publish it, screw them. You write it, so you write what's true. If it needs to be said, you say it all. And I was like, okay, so that's what I did. It took forever. And then when it came time to send them the manuscript, I was like, it's really long. Here's an idea. You could chop it into 2 books. It could be 2 volumes. And they were like, it is really long. We'll see. Let us read it. We'll see. And they wrote back eventually with reviews and stuff. And they said, don't change anything. We're going to publish it all, the whole thing. We're not going to make you change it. We're not going to make you cut it. And it won't be 2 volumes. It'll be one badass volume. And that's what it is. So it was really, really reassuring. But I think it also speaks to the fact that it fits together, and the endorsements are from all treatment approaches, and they're very strong and speak to this idea that it's kind of a comprehensive, integrated thing. What I want, what I hope people take from it is that I hope people get a better understanding of the processes that they're actually doing. Because you read a treatment manual and it tells you what to do, but it doesn't tell you what's happening when you do it. So that's perfectly fine if all your interventions always work. But if you're like everyone else and your interventions don't always work, or they don't always work the way you thought they were going to work, or the client says to you, that was really helpful, and you say, which part? Then you're going to have to know something more about the process. What exactly is the process, and when do I use it? And I think the future of therapy is more process oriented, that there's a convergence. You see that. It's not just me saying that. There's other authors, big theoreticians sort of saying somehow we're going to need a process based treatment. Or that's kind of the point of integration. And it's going to have to look across treatments and say, why does treatment work? And then it's sort of like, I think in the future, when you go to supervision or you try to watch your own videos, it's like, how can I make this better? The question isn't going to be, well, what intervention are you trying to do? It'll be, okay, so you're doing an intervention. What process are you trying to facilitate? that may be the right process or the wrong process. And then it's how can we rework your intervention to get that process? It might be switching out your intervention for something from a different treatment that works the same process. You see, it actually opens the world to be much more integrative. And I hope that readers can now work more thinking more broadly across treatment approaches. There are no purist therapists anymore. That doesn't exist. That's very, very antiquarian. Carl Rogers, if he were alive today, would not be doing person-centered therapy the way he talked about it in the 1960s. Beck wouldn't, if he was doing CBT today, if he were alive today, he wouldn't be, I believe he wouldn't be doing cognitive behavioral therapy the way he wrote about it, and so on and so forth, Freud and so on and so forth. These people were very, very innovative. They would be doing new things, right? And I think seeing what are the chief processes that clients do, it'll be like, you might like to drive this car and I like to drive that car, but the way the car is working under the hood is pretty similar, actually. But how is it working? And if you don't know, you're at the mercy of your intervention either working or mysteriously not working.
I think that's a great foresight, which I think leads to my last question. I mean, I think you're on the edge of the field, right? You're on the forefront of what is important for us to be looking at. From where you sit, what's like beyond the edge, right? Like if you're at the very edge, what do you think is coming on the horizon? And this, I know this gets into the speculation, which I respect how much research you have put into the work that you do. But yeah, what would you say is like if you're on the edge of the spear, what is on the tip of the edge of the spear?
I mean, I really think that for therapy to be better and for therapists to get better and for the training to be better, it's going to be more process oriented. That will become the guiding light. Like, what are you trying to do at this moment? And no, not what tool are you using? That would be the intervention. But what are you trying to do? And people have preferences. Some people are more rational. Some people are more touchy-feely. And they'll have different, just as like, I like my car to look like this. You like your car to look like that, right? I mean, those are preferences. And clients too will have preferences. But the fundamental way the person changes is going to end up emerging as a universal framework for working with emotion.
Yeah.
The brands will still exist, but the boundaries between them will become more and more transparent in a matter of operational preferences, but not fundamental differences.
Right.
The problem is the treatments as they're designed and written about claim a uniqueness that isn't really tenable based on the research and doesn't match clients' experiences. And that those are preferences. And so things like branding, registered trademarks, and so I think that hamstrings the development of treatment. And as we understand processes better, one thing in a treatment manual, I'll add this on at the end, is like it tells you what to do. So that's like an archer pulls out the bow and arrow, and they know I'm really good at shooting arrows. Awesome. Do you know what to shoot them at? Oh no, I don't. That's not in the manual because it isn't. Do you see what I mean? The markers are usually taught through supervision. There's some description of the marker for sure, but like you start to perceive the world differently. The client, you see things that you didn't see before. The better you attend to process, the more you start to see things that you just didn't see before. And each of those are opportunities now. So the lens of process, I think, becomes the future, both for training therapists, for becoming a better therapist, and also for research, rather than these silos. Well, I'm doing research on this treatment approach or that treatment approach. So I think that's the future, and it will lead to innovations that we can't quite imagine right now, I think.
I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot that is honestly a little scary is, do we really want highly skilled therapists? Because
I think about that too.
because
I
the
mean,
implications are kind of crazy.
I mean,
The implications are kind of
the thing
insane.
is, uh, some listeners are probably like, "What?"
Yeah, right. They're like, what are you talking
But
about?
I have noticed that I use 20% of my skill set for
Yeah.
80% of my clients, right? The difference between good therapists and poor therapists, and there are differences, we can go to any mental health setting and we could look at the outcomes of their clients and we could rank order these therapists. It can be done, it has been done over and over again. There are good therapists and there are less good therapists. And it's not their treatment approach. Sorry, it's not their treatment approach. It's not their interventions. It might be the way they do the interventions, but so the if you wanted to compare two therapists, and one is a better therapist than the other, or more is highly skilled, that skill level will only appear actually side by side, will only appear in a difficult client, or will only appear in things like how long it takes you to get the same treatment
Results.
effect,
Yeah.
right? I can do it in fewer sessions, or so and so can do it in, you know. So I think we want to know what to train people in. I think I'm okay with down tooling and having simpler training programs if they are simpler and more precise. But right now, it's like in any training program. Now, this is a different question. It's about training. We could do a different podcast, but it's like of all the things that are part of your training program, which ones explain the results you're getting in terms of client outcome? Some of them are just window dressing and some of them are not, right? And you see that for treatments too. There's some things we do in treatments that actually have no effect, and there are other things that do have an effect, but you have to do dismantling studies to figure that out. It's clear to me that understanding the process, no matter what, will make therapists more precise.
Well, look, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time. Um, on podcasts like this, it's typical to say like, where can people find you? So, where can people find you? Where can they buy a book?
Yeah, you can go well, you just Google Principles of Emotion Change. You can get it from APA directly. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on there's a APA version in Europe and the rest of the world. So you can buy it online. Booksellers will have it. Your psychology booksellers. Uh, I could be emailed. You could email me, not for the book, but I take questions. Yeah, a lot of things that I've researched have been based on questions people have asked, not always by email. And I encourage people to stay tuned.
Thank you very much.